Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to the Top Performance blog. So happy to be here with two of my colleagues, friends, and fellow authors of the Field Guide, Using Deliberate Practice to Improve Your Therapeutic Results. And in particular today, we have the honor of talking with Sam Malins, who has just published a brand new study that applied some of the ideas from the field guide. I'm always impressed when somebody publishes research because I know from having done this just how long it takes. And Sam, I have to say, you did this in record speed.
Thanks, Scott. Really great to see you both. And yeah, be able to talk about this study.
So we'll put a link in the video to the study that was published in Sage Journal. It's called The Feasibility and Acceptability of Automated Feedback in Deliberate Practice in Psychological Therapies for Anxiety and Depression. And Daryl, since you really published the first study on deliberate practice, I think it was back in, is it 2015 now?
Yeah.
Dang, that's
Gosh.
amazing.
Wow.
This really opened a door. We wrote an article in the Psychotherapy Network, or when I say we, I mean Mark Hubble and I wrote this article. We've been intrigued by the work of Anders Ericsson and the promise, really, that here was a way to push beyond our professional development plateau that our field had really been on, at least if you trust what the research is saying, for the last 50 years. We've had lots of development, new models, new treatments, new diagnoses, but our outcomes have remained relatively flat. There is some good news, and the outcomes are good. Secondly, I think we are reaching a much more broad and diverse group of people than we did 50 years ago, but we're not pushing the effectiveness envelope so much. So deliberate practice seemed to provide a bit of an answer to that. Maybe if we learned how to apply that in psychotherapy. Daryl, you did the first study, as I said, seemed to show that therapists with better outcomes actually engaged in more deliberate practice. We did the Better Results book where we laid out the ideas. Basic idea was probably need to measure your results to find out how good you are and then focus on some of those deficits. Sam, you joined us in the second book, and we were really talking about how we could leverage the factors that have influence on outcome to in our deliberate practice efforts to improve outcome. And since that time, the number of books and articles have just exploded. I think APA right now, the American Psychological Association, has something like 20 different books on deliberate practice, not counting our two books that we did. But your study is a little different than these studies and the other books. Can you just tell us about how, what, without getting too much in the weeds about your study yet, but how is your view of deliberate practice maybe different from both how people think of practice in general and its application to improving outcomes in psychotherapy?
Yeah. Well, as you'll both know, I've been kind of following and inspired by that work. And, still have conversations where people are like, what? It hasn't improved in 40, 50 years? And that was definitely me, was kind of like, surely we can do something about it. And then the work you guys did with deliberate practice really kind of inspired me along this track. And I think this study was aiming to do a couple of things. It was firstly trying to translate this into UK National Health Service kind of implementation, like in a kind of publicly funded body where you got therapists, not well, lots of therapists are busy, but like therapists who are unlikely to kind of get the time for this kind of thing, and then implementing the kind of approaches that we'd written about, that like the numerous kind of international experts had contributed to from the field guide to better results. Could that make a difference? And this kind of like augmentation piece, kind of a question of like, actually, if we gave them feedback so that from the very first session the actual content of what they and their clients are saying in one-to-one therapy is kind of turned into a kind of relatively accurate idea of whether this is on track or off track to improve by the last session, so that it draws their eye to the sessions where, oh, maybe that's one I should focus on, maybe that's one's okay, I can leave that, so that their deliberate practice sessions are more focused on those kind of skill deficits where we know actually that's the best place to put your time and effort.
Hmm. Because I think one of the aspects of the work that we've done that has been criticized is that if you follow our advice, you really can't do deliberate practice for the first year. You basically have to gather outcome data. But you're saying that this particular study actually was an attempt to start right. This could be for somebody that's a grad student.
Yes, yeah, that was it. Was to kind of like get to the kind of, I know a bit more about what my skill strengths are and what my skill deficits are a bit quicker. As I'm sure we'll get to, we didn't quite achieve what we'd hoped with that, but that was the aspiration.
Hmm. And can you just say a bit about the difference between the kind of study you've attempted here and published and a traditional RCT? What are the sort of broad
Yes.
brushstroke differences?
Yeah. So I guess the big difference here was like the level that we're kind of measuring, the kind of key level was at the therapist level. So like we do something with the therapists and see if that makes a difference. Whereas I guess most RCTs are at the kind of client patient level. So you do something different like with or for the kind of client and see if it goes this way or it goes that way. And this was much more about like, can we help the therapists to do what they do differently and see if that changes both them and the kind of clients that they are seeing. So it's kind
Hmm.
of trying to see like if there's a way of adjusting this flat line at the
Hmm.
therapist level.
I guess in some ways, and tell me if your view is the same, that in an RCT, the therapists aren't learning, they're
Yeah,
executing. And the question is, did this method work between these people with this particular problem and these providers doing this method?
that's
But,
exactly it. Yeah.
but you're saying that you're actually helping people implement changes in their individual practice along the way.
Yes, that's it. That it's not just the therapists are like a tool to deliver the thing that you want to happen. It's actually, can we can we help them learn so that they can do whatever they do differently, better?
Hmm. And where do deficits figure into this picture?
Yes. Well, I guess it's that this idea that that's where you would want to focus your time, energy, efforts with deliberate practice. And I suppose you want to be focused on the things that I remember when we were writing Field Guide to Better Results, we talked a lot about what's the biggest lever, what's the biggest thing you can make the difference with. And so you want your time and effort to be focused on the things that are going to give you the biggest change from the time you invest in them. And
Hmm.
so we that was kind of why we used the field guide approach of like focusing on trans theoretical bits of therapy, parts of the aspects of therapy that are well known to affect outcome. And this was actually really important for like a kind of like in practice like from therapists in practice, because it was like a really rangy group of participants, like CBT therapists, health psychologists, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists. If we'd have just focused on one model, we wouldn't have been able to do that kind of thing, and nor would we in future.
Hmm.
I think that the thing I really like about the design for this is exactly what you said, is individualized to the therapist's learning edge of
Mm.
what they need to work on. So maybe if you could just take us a bird's eye view of the design of the study, walk us through that and then lead us to what you guys found.
Yes. So we identified therapists across like a range of different services, some in quite specialist services, some in kind of general mental health settings. But it had to be services that were already doing routine outcome monitoring, so that they already had this kind of like foundation that we could build on in terms of like identifying like who's being helped, who's not being helped.
Hmm.
Then they were invited to come then the 10 weeks before we did anything different. The outcomes that they were getting then were kind of used as the baseline to see if this made a difference. Then we offered them like a 2-day deliberate practice training, really focused on what we talked about in the field guide to better results and that framing of deliberate practice. And then they had like 10 weeks, or they had 8 weeks then of a combination of one-to-one supervision, so one-to-one kind of deliberate practice orientated supervision, then small group supervision, so rotating who was the kind of focused therapist and then the group helping them work on their kind of skill deficits, and then a bit of like individual time where they could review sessions, they could like record themselves trying a different way of doing things and then reflect on their learning from the previous like 3 weeks and then plan for the following like group of sessions. So this was like broadly 2 hours a week, and including the training was like 32 hours in total. So that was kind of broadly what we were doing. And then we measured like therapist skills, the outcomes of the 10 weeks before, the 10 weeks during, from the clients that they were seeing, and then feasibility and acceptability in that kind of time frame.
I was just going to ask, I think we're on the same line here. The first one is that how were therapist deficits identified?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So a few routes to kind of skill deficit identification. So there were people who would come, so from that kind of 2-day training and like identifying like what the kind of frame was for the kind of key skills that were prognostic, and the kind of the therapist kind of like what you've developed, what you guys have developed, where it's kind of outlines every skill that could be like prognostic. They completed that for themselves as well to identify like, actually, I think I'm good at this. And then that was kind of like just individually validated through their kind of review of their caseloads, review of the sessions, and the kind of automated feedback that they were getting. So they're kind of gradually honing their view onto the things that are like, I think it's this, or maybe it's this specific thing. Okay, let's practice that a bit. Okay, from the feedback I'm getting, maybe it's this, and that's helping them get closer into the kind of like a smaller set of skills that they can really press into.
So the TDPA
TDPA, yes.
was part of this taxonomy of deliberate practice activities in combination with the automated feedback that they were getting.
Yes.
To identify those deficits. They're working through the training phase, that middle phase, focusing on those activities, trying to learn new things, apply new ideas, etc.
Yes, that's it. Yes. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, I think this would probably be more of a test of like, was the TDPA and reviewing your sessions and looking at your outcomes like helpful to improving deliberate practice than the automated feedback? I think there's a number of really significant changes we would make if we were doing that kind of thing again.
Can I just put a break here for 1 second and ask you to help us understand the context in which you conducted the study? I know you said it was within the NHS, and I'm doing a little purposeful drum roll before you do the reveal about what you found, but I want to get a sense of the challenges involved in conducting a study like that, say, as opposed to traditional RCT, where you get the top therapists in 2 different approaches, you randomly send clients to them, and then you compare the outcomes at the end. Can you just give us a little bit of a feeling for that?
Yes. So we're going to leads for clinical services in the kind of across the region and saying, hey, we will pay for your therapists to come and participate in the study. We'll buy out their time. It will cost you nothing, and they might actually improve. But even with that, it was quite, I think, understandably kind of hard because the NHS, like lots of kind of public health systems, is like really hard pressed. So I think it wouldn't be I think we're more likely to have got like the kind of really enthusiastic people to have come. So I think, you know, maybe people who are like really pushing the edge in terms of trying to improve already. So I think the kind of key challenge was, one was just recruitment, even with kind of money changing hands, was hard. Then even with that, actually, all like therapists were finding it hard to like protect this time that's kind of like that deliberately been protected for them, because the pressures of clinical work, managing risk, like doing the kind of administrative bits, like kind of maintaining their kind of therapeutic registration, all that kind of thing was pushing in from different angles, um, in a
Dealing with
way
the
that,
reality,
sorry, say again, Daryl.
dealing with the clinical realities of the day to
Yes.
day.
Yes. Yeah. And I think having been like the therapist in a few trials, it's like that's a bit different to like, okay, I'm just going to take you out of your normal clinical job and just going to give you a couple of hours of something each week. That's quite different to, okay, my job is to deliver. Not that that is easy, but it's a bit different when you've got like, this is my job for this bit of time.
Hmm. Hmm. Perfect. So tell us what you've found.
Yeah. So, uh, kind of I've got we were talking about earlier, I've got the internal like journal reviewer in my head. So I think the first thing to say is this was a feasibility and acceptability study. So it wasn't powered for like, you know, can we now just roll this out across the world? But that what we did find was that from this kind of amount of this type of deliberate practice, so that there were large effects on therapist skill using like a well-known skill assessment, like an adaptation of the FIS. So this is facilitative interpersonal skills task. Large effects on all parts of the FIS, all of the skills, pre to post. Like high level of feasibility and acceptability, and we interviewed, not me, but like one of the researchers interviewed the therapists on this, and I think a real standout for me was in those qualitative interviews, we're bearing in mind, we're asking people to look at the thing that they are worst at in their therapeutic practice and focus on that for 2 hours a week. It was really interesting that people are saying, actually, I feel more alive. I feel more enthusiastic about my work. I feel like ready to go at my job again. And I think it is that thing of actually like being more engaged in your job and feeling like you're getting better is actually a really valuable thing, not just for kind of clinical effects.
Hmm.
Just think,
Yeah.
Sam, we have not talked about this, but when we did the difficult conversations in therapy study,
Mm,
that was the anecdotal feedback we got at the background as well, though we didn't report that side of things because it's remoralizing. It gives people a sense of verve, a feeling like they have something they can engage with. There's something they can actually work towards.
yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. And we
Hmm.
found a similar thing, actually. This is like separate thing, but we were using like a deliberate practice, like using deliberate practice principles in the way we were training cancer care staff like 2 or 3 years ago. And the main thing we wanted to know was like, actually, does this improve their psychological support skills for the patients they're seeing? But we
Hmm.
also found that it significantly reduced burnout, significantly improved their own well-being by participating in this, especially if they took part in like supervision, like deliberate practice orientated supervision after.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I definitely was.
Yeah, well, pleased, actually. It is a side benefit, it seems, to deliberate practice that you're re-engaged in your
Mm.
purpose as a clinician, which is to actually be helpful. It also seems like, from what you're saying, that engaging in deliberate practice gave people a face-saving way to focus on what they do the least well.
Yes.
And I mean face saving not in a shallow way, but I'm really taking care of my weak spots as a clinician.
Yes. And I remember this was definitely like a learning point for me when we were writing the field guide to the better results. Was you guys definitely like wrote about this, that actually normalizing the idea of like, this is normal and good for me to look at the bits that I'm finding hardest if I
Mm,
want to improve. And I think as well, like this kind of idea that if you've not done that, they're actually probably going to see improvement quite quickly. So it can be quite encouraging doing that if you've not done that before.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah,
But the study did not show an improvement in outcome
not significantly. So
in the
what
direction, but not okay.
yes. So what we found was that like I was saying, they were using the same measures of for routine outcome monitoring, and they were the GAD-7 for anxiety, PHQ-9 for depression symptoms, and like you take the 10 weeks before to the 10 weeks of, you know, you would want like really the 10 weeks after, but like that's what we had. There was about 10% more of the clients seen had a reliable improvement in anxiety, and 3% of the clients had 3% more clients had reliable improvement in depression. So
Hmm.
looks like it's heading in the right direction, but most
Right.
likely not powered for that. So, but and not significant
Right,
differences in that
right,
way.
right.
I think that's so interesting because you've done a couple of things in this so-called feasibility study, because you had the actual real world situation, number one. You had the individualized learning, that's number two. And then you're trying to then see if this, in the learning sciences, they call it the transfer of learning, whether this is generalized to improvement. That's super cool. We didn't have that for the DCT study. We only had we zoomed in so tightly on the learning and the principles. We weren't able to look at the generalization effect. I think that's a real plus of what you're doing.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And it's really kind of the first, and admittedly, it's a feasibility and acceptability study, but it's really the first study on deliberate practice that has all of these components as part of the process. It's really a an amazing step forward for this particular area of research, Sam. So congratulations.
well, and thank you guys, because yeah, I don't know if I'd be doing this kind of stuff if you hadn't been like made me think, whoa, we need to do something. And there is something that maybe we could do with this from your work on deliberate practice in this
Well, but
area.
but you added another piece that Scott and I, we've been scratching our heads trying to really understand the details about this. So if you could just go down the rabbit hole for a couple of minutes with us
Mm.
and explain to us and the listeners the automated feedback. Like, tell us
Yes.
this machine learning piece. I mean, there's so much talk about AI. Actually, most people are referring to generative AI. But talk to us about this little piece of the automated feedback. What it is,
Yes.
what were the constraints, what you learned from that?
Yeah. So I agree. So this is separate from like generative AI. I think that's a legitimate thing to investigate. It's not what that's kind of like maybe separate from therapy. Could you help? Could you get like a generative AI model to help people? This isn't that. This is kind of like how can we use what we've got and what we're getting from technology to help therapists do what they're already doing better? How can it facilitate that? And so I'll tell you the kind of scenario we were hoping for, where we ended up, and maybe some ideas of where next. So um, we had some data from like a couple of clinical trials, particularly early sessions, like sessions 1 and 2, where it's quite hard to tell, even using like routine outcome monitoring, like where's this going? So, and we trained a machine learning model. So we give it like the transcripts of those sessions. We tell it of those transcripts, like these people improve by the end of therapy, these people don't. What are the patterns that you can identify that would be like associated with improvement or not? And can you then, so we do that with like a sample and train it, then we get another group of sessions and validate it and say, okay, now you just tell us, did these people improve or not? That's
Hmm.
kind of like in a nutshell what it was trying to do.
And just to be clear on this point, so these are the pre-training data. That's
Yes.
not from the therapists that you are trying to help,
No,
correct?
you're right. Yes, that's it. So it's been pre-trained by some other therapists who were like the therapists in a couple of clinical trials, like therapy trials, the sessions from them and the outcomes from them. And then what we've done alongside that over a few years was try to identify specific, especially early as well, sessions 1 and 2, early like interaction types that were kind of indicative of like improvement or not. So
Hey,
like,
Scott, I just love the way he said a few years, like it's just rolled by.
This is as
It's only a few years, like
it's just a few years. And this is the thing, this research, your study, Daryl, 2015, our article, 2007,
Mm,
this first really complete package of feasibility and acceptability testing, 2026. So we're
yeah,
seeing the length of time it takes, almost a professional lifetime to go
yeah,
from thinking and conceptualizing to execution and even testing to find out is this even possible? So yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So have you got any
It's
new research coming out there, Sam?
so
Next week?
yeah, that's it. Give me some time.
Anyway, sorry to
Oh,
interrupt.
yes. Where were we? So yeah, so that's kind of like the prognostic piece. And then, yeah, like you say, for a few years, we worked on this kind of coding scheme so that you could turn by turn identify, this is an interaction which is like associated with better improvement. This is an interaction which is associated with poorer improvement. We tried to train this model to identify them as well, with some success, but not enough. So we got it to identify like 2/3 of those kind of interactions that were helpful and unhelpful, but we felt like that wasn't enough because it meant that like a third of the time it's going to be telling you like unhelpful feedback. So we kept it simple. Basically, you record your session, the machine learning tool tells you this is a session which is on track or it's off track based on what was said during that session. That's the kind of feedback that they got. Simpler than we
based
would
on
have
the
hoped. But
based on the transcript of the sessions.
yes, yeah.
And then they get sort of a generic, more on track versus off track versus minute by minute statement.
Yeah, so what we'd hoped to have was a kind of dashboard which had like the kind of 7 key interaction types that were prognostic. So it would say, hey, you were really strong on like action planning and idea generation, like you really helped the client get engaged in that. But actually, you didn't have much, or it didn't go very well when you were trying to help them kind of get a problem, an understanding of their problems. That didn't go very well. Press
Hmm.
here, and here's like some extracts of where that didn't go so well. So it's focusing you in on the bits. But
Mm.
yeah, I that I think the big thing is that I was naive to how much data you need to train a machine learning model. Probably like 100x what we had is what you need to do
Wow,
that accurately.
Okay.
100x. Wow.
That's like 18-month-old news. So it might be that,
Mm.
and these models are getting better all the time. So it
Yeah.
might be that there's like some of these small shot models where you can have smaller data sets that could be trained with less data. But certainly at the time of development, it was like, this is really small data. And I was like, we got 300-400 sessions, that's loads, when that's not in machine learning terms.
Mm.
But Sam, can you speak to if you know any information about this, the therapist's view of receiving that kind of automated feedback? What's the
Yeah.
take for
So
therapists?
again, this is another bit that a bit of me is like, we did have quite a lot of time spent with like patients and carers, like members of the public, their views on this.
Yep.
I think we took their advice, but probably needed to go a bit further. So therapists found it hard because some of the feedback they were getting was stuff like clients saying, "Oh, is this gonna like take your job if we record this session?" So I
Hmm.
think there were misconceptions about the use of it, but
Right.
maybe just a broader mistrust of AI in therapy that it exposed. And so I think there was even, and part of what we'd done was like build in like reviews of the feedback it was getting. So like every 4th session, there would be a kind of like, hey, look, this is the kind of feedback I'm getting, that we aren't really connecting on the way we're planning what you do after sessions, or actually like maybe I'm not listening as well, or I'm not being as empathic as what do you think of that? So that was kind of like built in, not from the feedback, but from like what was going on with deliberate practice.
Mm.
But that definitely wasn't enough. I think it needed to be earlier in the chain than like the therapist turning up to the first session and saying, hey, we might record our sessions and feed it to a machine learning model. I think it needed to be clearer what the
Mm.
purpose was before it
Mm.
got to there.
And the machine learning component is I understand it, and feel free to correct me if not. is sort of a separate component from this deliberative process that you had ongoing, identifying of deficits, et cetera, rehearsing them, getting them focused to a point, et cetera.
Yes,
Is that right?
that's definitely it. Yes. So I guess the potential fringe benefit of that not going so well was then the therapists spent more time kind of listening to their own sessions, but and like identifying for themselves using the TDPA, like what their skill deficits were, like working a bit harder on that. Whereas I guess we'd hoped to be able to do that a bit quicker in a bit more of an automated way.
Mm.
But yes, I think yeah, the point that
So
you made,
I
Scott,
guess
maybe deepen the learning.
then what you're saying then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of does two major things, which is I don't think is trivial. I think it's a huge thing, which is one, it pauses people, and
Mm.
then two, it guides their attention to say, hey, focus on this for a little bit.
Yes, yeah, that's definitely it. And I think we'd also tried to set it up, and again, I definitely would want something along like lines of this if we did it again in future, was that this was kind of like owned by the therapist, so it couldn't be like if it's giving this kind of feedback routinely for every client, it doesn't
Yeah.
become your line manager's thing. It's like, this is for my development so that you're working with it. It's your thing as the therapist, not like not a line managing like tool kind
Right.
of thing.
Right.
Or
Right.
KPI kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
Hmm. So, Sam, if this is the feasibility and acceptability study, I think I've known you long enough, and I know you well enough that this isn't the end of the journey here. So, so what is already in that feverish brain, research brain of yours? Where are you going next?
Stay out of my brain, Scott. That is, yes, this is the kind of current thing where my mind is at. So haven't applied for funding, so I think we're talking like a year from now at the absolute
Hmm.
earliest.
Hmm.
But I would be really, two things. I'd really be intrigued to work on that automated feedback bit separately, see if we can make that better.
Hmm.
See if we can make that fit better within services so that it's not like the last thing I'd want is for it to be like a barrier for clients or for therapists, which I think in some ways the way we'd implemented it was,
Hmm.
and it wasn't
Hmm.
as good as we'd hoped.
Hmm.
It wasn't given as much detail as we'd hoped. But I think in the long run, I'd really love to do this as a kind of therapy, like a different type of RCT where it's like at the therapist level. So
Hmm.
something along the lines of, how much does it cost to take therapists out for 32 hours? And then we've got one on where they come and get something like this or something like this, hopefully like a developed version of this kind of like
Hmm.
field guide, deliberate practice, maybe with automated feedback. And the other arm gets the same amount of money to go and spend on CPD. Goes, take
Yeah,
that and go and
fabulous.
do some CPD, whatever you'd like to choose, so that
Hmm.
it's a real comparison of like, this is what we would do if we had
Hmm.
CPD money and time, and let's see if deliberate practice is different from that in like
Hmm.
skill and outcome. And
Hmm.
I'd really like to do like longer outcome follow-up so that it's kind of
Yeah.
powered for that.
I mean, I do know we've got multiple lines of evidence now that seem to suggest that the result of a deliberate practice approach to professional development might not just be outcomes, which, if we trust what the data says about other areas of deliberate practice, that outcomes improve slowly
Middle. Yeah.
over time, but that the side benefits, that there's less turnover, there's fewer sick days, more engagement in the work. Those might be reasonable dependent variables as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess this point that like lots of the service leads who were involved in the study or advised on the study were really like interested in deliberate practice, but especially from a kind of efficiency and effectiveness angle. But I think that's an interesting side point, that it might be that the efficiency comes from like helping your therapists feel more engaged and active in the work as much as it is in improving the outcomes.
I know Daryl and I were talking before you joined us about this through line of efficiency in every conversation, efficiency in productivity. And to many people, deliberate practice appears to be neither. It takes a tremendous amount of time for very little return, if the return is solely the outcomes at least.
But I think that's why the promise of certain approaches to say this is what you should do in general en masse, it's likely, I'm prepared to be wrong, but it's likely to make us go in circles. Whereas what you're doing, Sam, you're saying let's figuring out where you are at so that we can figure out where you need to go individually, but then trying to figure out something you could do collectively. That's a sweet spot. That's a difficult road that you're taking. I hats off to you, Sam.
Well, I think it's, well, like just taking the TDPA as a like tool that was just phenomenal, because I'm just in writing, and then since the field guide, just using it for myself, I knew that this was going to be like a really valuable tool for people to just like to support self-reflection on skills, but having the opportunity to then actually put it into like deliberate practice opportunities. I think I was surprised that like people were so invigorated by it.
Could I ask you, Sam, based on your experience of this study and just really taking the ideas in the field guide and applying them in a very pragmatic way, what are the biggest threats? Maybe one, two, or three, if you have them, to this way of thinking as contrasted with the traditional professional development approach?
Yes. Well, in the, not just in the interviews, but like the end of study kind of debrief that I did with all the kind of participating therapists, there was pretty much uniformly this kind of like, I've told everyone in my service that this has been useful, but I really don't know how this is gonna work when I'm back into my normal job. And so I think I'm obviously hopeful that evidence could support that, but I'm aware that there's like usually a bit of a lag between evidence and implementation into routine practice. The idea that a kind like at a service level, people that we'd be prepared to go, you know what, take even an hour a week, but take a couple of hours a week to work on your skills, because we can see that this is going to make a difference, instead of just bash out some more sessions. I think I just think that's a hard sell. But even if we had the evidence, and I think that's gonna, I don't think it's an avoidable barrier. I think it's one that's we've got to kind of work with, is the kind of like, yeah, it seems like a nice to have, even if it's not. I think that would be definitely number one. I think there is something about the things that look like they get you efficiency that maybe don't in the long run, can be quite hard. And I don't mind like things that might be like, oh, I think this could be efficient, as long as it's evaluated and there's some kind of data behind it. I worry about things where it's like, this is so self-evidently better and more shareable, then we don't even need to evaluate it. I worry about that to some degree. Yeah.
Okay. Sam, thank you very much for taking the time with us and for all the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, and hopefully we'll talk in a couple of weeks and you'll have another study out.
Brilliant. No, thank you both for making the time as well. Yes, as I said, thank you for all you've done and are doing. It's definitely kind of, yeah, inspired me, and it's changing practice therapists.
Well, likewise, what you're doing is inspiring all of us. So really, that's good news for everyone.
Thanks.